Violent riots just exploded in Sydney, Australia, and what triggered them will leave you absolutely speechless. Anti-Israel protesters attacked police officers, ignored court orders, and turned the streets of one of the world's most peaceful democracies into a complete war zone. 27 people arrested, 10 of them for physically assaulting police officers. Streets filled with pepper spray and chaos. And here is the part that will stop you cold. This didn't happen because of some domestic political crisis. This didn't happen because of economic collapse or government corruption. This happened because the President of Israel came to Australia to sit with grieving families, to hold the hands of parents whose children were murdered at a Hanukkah celebration, to stand at the memorial for 15 innocent Jewish Australians massacred on December 14th at Bondi Beach in the deadliest terrorist attack in Australian history. That's what caused these riots, a head of state visiting to comfort terrorism victims. Think about that for 1 second. 15 people murdered at a religious holiday celebration. A community devastated by the worst terrorist attack their country has ever seen. And when the President of Israel comes specifically to mourn with them, thousands of protesters take to the streets in violent rage, attacking police officers and ignoring court orders. This isn't happening in the Middle East. This isn't happening in some unstable authoritarian state. This is Sydney, Australia, one of the most modern, educated, prosperous, peaceful cities on the entire planet. And radical anti-Israel activists just turned it into a battlefield while a community wept for its dead. But here is what makes this story even more devastating than you already think it is. The former president of the Australian Jewish Association revealed something that should send chills down your spine. For 2.5 years before the Bondi Beach massacre, law enforcement in Australia was failing to adequately respond to escalating anti-Semitic violence. 1,600 anti-Semitic incidents in just 1 year. Synagogues vandalized, Jewish schools targeted, arson attacks, public harassment. And authorities largely looked the other way. 2.5 years of warnings ignored. 2.5 years of a community telling authorities the situation was getting worse. 2.5 years of inadequate response. And then 15 people were murdered at a Hanukkah celebration. And now, weeks later, violent riots erupt because a visiting president dared to come and mourn with the survivors. This is not just an Australian story. This is a global story about where anti-Semitism is heading in Western democracies. It is happening in France. It is happening in Germany. It is happening in the United Kingdom. It is happening in the United States. And now it is exploding violently in Australia. When you understand the full picture of what happened in Sydney, what led up to it, and what it reveals about the catastrophic failure of Western governments to confront rising anti-Semitism, you will realize this is one of the most important stories happening anywhere in the world right now. Let me walk you through every single detail of what happened, why it happened, and what it means for all of us. Let's go back to December 14th, 2025. Bondi Beach, Sydney, one of the most iconic locations in the entire world, known globally as a symbol of Australian culture, sunshine, and relaxed beach life. On that December evening, families gathered to celebrate Hanukkah, the Jewish festival of lights. Children played, parents celebrated, grandparents watched their grandchildren enjoy the holiday. A community came together in joy and faith for a religious celebration. Then terrorists opened fire. 15 people were killed, 15 innocent civilians, murdered at a religious celebration by terrorists who specifically targeted a Jewish community event. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in Australian history. The entire country went into shock. Political leaders across the political spectrum condemned it. Vigils were held. Memorials were established. Australians of all backgrounds expressed solidarity with the Jewish community. But here is what the memorials and the vigils didn't address, what the political statements didn't confront, what the expressions of solidarity glossed over. This attack didn't come from nowhere. The American Jewish Committee's timeline reveals that the Bondi Beach attack came after a sustained and documented increase in anti-Semitic threats and violence across Australia. The Executive Council of Australian Jewry recorded more than 1,600 anti-Semitic incidents between October 2024 and September 2025. That followed more than 2,000 incidents the year before. Over 2,000 anti-Semitic incidents in 1 year. Then over 1,600 the following year. In Australia, a country that proudly presents itself to the world as a model of multicultural tolerance and democratic values. Think about what those numbers actually represent. 2,000 incidents in 1 year means roughly 5 to 6 anti-Semitic incidents every single day somewhere in Australia. Vandalism, threats, harassment, arson, physical attacks, every single day for an entire year, then every single day the following year. And what was the Australian government's response? What did law enforcement do when confronted with this tsunami of anti-Semitic violence? According to David Adler, former president of the Australian Jewish Association, the answer is not enough, not nearly enough. Adler said, "For nearly 2.5 years, law enforcement was failing in the face of incitement to hatred and anti-Semitism. We saw a reinvigoration and terrible incidents occurring around the country, culminating on December 14th with the Bondi Beach massacre." Culminating, that is the word he used. The massacre was the culmination of 2.5 years of escalating violence that authorities failed to adequately address. It wasn't a random act. It wasn't unpredictable. It was the predictable endpoint of a trajectory that authorities could see coming and chose not to stop. Why didn't they stop it? Why did Australian law enforcement fail to respond adequately for 2.5 years while a community was being targeted? We will get to that answer shortly. And when you hear it, you will understand why this failure wasn't unique to Australia. Now let's talk about what happened when Israeli President Isaac Herzog came to Australia in February 2026. Herzog came with a specific and unambiguous purpose. He was not coming to make political speeches about Israeli policy. He was not coming to defend military operations or engage in geopolitical debates. He was coming to be with the Jewish community in Australia, to stand with them in their grief, to honor the memory of 15 people murdered at a religious celebration. He visited Bondi Beach. He met with the families of the victims. He participated in commemoration ceremonies alongside Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. He sat with parents who lost children, children who lost parents, a community trying to process unimaginable tragedy. In a message posted on X during the visit, Herzog wrote, "With Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, community leader Rabbi Yehoram Ullman, bereaved families and members of the Jewish community, we gathered to honor the memory of the 15 victims of the Bondi terrorist attacks. The terrorists sought to sow terror among the Jewish people, and we respond with renewed Jewish pride, choosing life and hope." Choosing life and hope. Those are the words of a community that refused to be broken by terrorism, a community saying, "You tried to destroy us with violence. We respond by continuing to live, by continuing to celebrate, by continuing to be proud of who we are." That is what Herzog came to support. That is what his visit was about, and thousands of people decided that was worth rioting over. Monday evening, February 9th, 2026. Thousands of anti-Israel protesters gathered near Sydney Town Hall to demonstrate against Herzog's visit. Authorities had already established restrictions on protest routes. A court had issued a specific legal order, establishing an exclusion zone for demonstrations near certain locations. These restrictions were not attempts to silence legitimate political protest. The right to protest is fundamental in Australian democracy. These were reasonable, court-ordered public safety measures in a situation where a community that had just survived a terrorist attack needed protection during a visit focused on mourning and healing. The protesters ignored the court order completely. When police moved to disperse the crowd in accordance with legal requirements, violence erupted. Protesters turned on police officers. 27 people were arrested, 10 of them specifically and separately charged with physically assaulting police officers. Pepper spray was deployed. Confrontations broke out across multiple locations. Police were put in an impossible position trying to enforce a legal court order against thousands of protesters determined to violate it. Adler described the scene as a shameful spectacle and noted that the court decision establishing an exclusion zone had been deliberately ignored by what he called radical activists. But then he said something extraordinary, something that reveals just how bad the situation had become for Australia's Jewish community before this night. He said, "Our community welcomes finally seeing a reaction from New South Wales police. For nearly 2.5 years, law enforcement was failing in the face of incitement to hatred and anti-Semitism. We are therefore perhaps seeing the beginning of a response from law enforcement, which we welcome." Read that carefully. The Jewish community in Australia was so accustomed to law enforcement not protecting them that they specifically expressed gratitude and relief at finally seeing police actually enforce the law against anti-Semitic agitators. They were grateful. Not that police went above and beyond, not that authorities provided exceptional protection. Grateful that police simply did their basic job and enforced existing court orders. That is an indictment of how bad things had gotten. A community so used to being failed by authorities that basic law enforcement feels like a gift. Now let's examine what the protesters claim they were demonstrating about and why their stated justifications collapse under examination. Protesters said they were opposing Israel's military operations in Gaza and objecting to Herzog's presence in Australia. This framing presents the demonstrations as legitimate political protest about a genuine geopolitical conflict with real humanitarian dimensions. And it is true that opposition to Israel's military operations in Gaza is a legitimate political position held by millions of people worldwide. Criticizing Israeli government policy is not inherently anti-Semitic. These are important distinctions that need to be acknowledged honestly. But the moral logic of these particular protests falls apart completely when you examine the context. Herzog was not coming to Australia to promote military operations. He was not hosting a press conference to defend Israeli government policy. He was not engaging in political advocacy of any kind. He was coming specifically, exclusively, to mourn with a community that had just experienced its worst terrorist attack. The entire stated purpose of his visit was humanitarian, to comfort the bereaved, to honor the dead, to stand with survivors. Choosing to stage massive, violent, court order violating demonstrations specifically timed to coincide with that visit sends a message that goes far beyond any political objection to Israeli government policy. It says, "We do not care about your murdered dead. We will disrupt even your grief. There is no moment sacred enough, no tragedy severe enough, no community vulnerability deep enough that we will not use it for our political purposes." That is not political activism. That is the deliberate targeting of a grieving community for harassment at their most vulnerable moment. And physically attacking police officers while doing it removes the last shred of moral legitimacy from the entire demonstration. You cannot claim to be protesting for human rights while beating police officers trying to enforce legal court orders. You cannot claim to stand for justice while ignoring judicial decisions you disagree with. You cannot claim the moral high ground while turning a mourning ceremony into a riot. Australian Member of Parliament Andrew Wallace put it simply and accurately, "Australians who live in democracy have the right to peacefully and lawfully protest. What we saw last night was not peaceful, and it was certainly not in line with the directions given by police. Not peaceful, not lawful." That is the official parliamentary assessment of what happened. Now let's talk about why this is happening and why it is happening now, because the Sydney riots didn't occur in isolation. They are part of a global pattern that has been accelerating since October 2023, when Hamas launched its terrorist attack on Israel on October 7, 2023, killing over 1,200 people and taking hundreds hostage. Something shifted in Western countries. Anti-Semitic incidents that had been increasing gradually for years suddenly exploded. In France, anti-Semitic incidents increased by over 300% in the months following October 7th. 300%. Jewish schools in Paris began requiring armed security guards. Synagogues were vandalized repeatedly. Jewish families reported being afraid to wear anything identifying them as Jewish in public. In France, in 2023 and 2024. In Germany, a country that spent decades confronting its Holocaust history and building extensive anti-Nazi laws and education, anti-Semitic incidents reached record highs. Jewish community leaders said publicly that they had not seen anything like it since the Nazi era, in modern democratic Germany. In the United Kingdom, Jewish community organizations reported anti-Semitic incidents at historically unprecedented rates. Jewish students at some of the world's most prestigious universities reported being excluded from campus organizations, harassed in dormitories, and physically threatened at Oxford, at Cambridge, at the London School of Economics. In the United States, the Anti-Defamation League recorded anti-Semitic incidents at the highest levels in its history. Jewish students at Harvard, Columbia, MIT, and dozens of other elite universities reported feeling unsafe on campus. Synagogues across the country increased security and hired armed guards. Jewish neighborhoods in major cities organized private security patrols because they didn't trust local authorities to protect them. And in Australia, as we have already documented, over 2,000 anti-Semitic incidents one year, over 1,600 the next, culminating in 15 people murdered at a Hanukkah celebration. This is not a coincidence. This is not a series of isolated incidents in different countries. This is a coordinated global escalation of anti-Semitism that has been building for years and exploding since October 2023. And Western governments have been catastrophically slow to acknowledge it, name it accurately, and respond to it with the urgency it demands. Why? This is the question that needs to be answered honestly, even though the honest answer is politically uncomfortable. In most Western democracies, Muslim immigrant communities and progressive activist communities form important constituencies within left-wing political coalitions. These communities include many people with strong pro-Palestinian sympathies and many people who view any strong response to pro-Palestinian protests as politically unacceptable. This creates a deeply perverse political incentive structure for left-wing governments. Strongly condemning anti-Semitic incidents that occur in the context of pro-Palestinian activism risks alienating important political constituencies. So governments equivocate. They issue carefully worded statements that condemn violence in general without specifically naming anti-Semitism. They call for calm without calling out the ideology driving the violence. They warn against importing foreign conflicts without explaining why certain foreign conflicts seem to produce riots while others do not. David Adler's devastating comment about 2.5 years of inadequate law enforcement response is not simply a criticism of police tactics. It is an indictment of the political decisions made at the highest levels of Australian government that constrained police responses to anti-Semitic violence because of electoral calculations. In plain language, Australian politicians made a calculation that protecting Jewish Australians from anti-Semitic violence was less politically valuable than avoiding confrontation with pro-Palestinian activist communities. And 15 people paid for that calculation with their lives at Bondi Beach. Now let's look at what Australian officials said in response to the Sydney riots, because their words reveal exactly the problem. Australian leaders called for restraint and warned against importing a foreign conflict into Australian streets. Think about that framing. Importing a foreign conflict, as if Jewish Australians who were murdered at a Hanukkah celebration in Sydney are somehow responsible for importing a foreign conflict into their own country, as if the correct response to anti-Semitic violence in Australia is to ask everyone to calm down, rather than to clearly and forcefully name anti-Semitism as the problem. This is the political cowardice that has allowed anti-Semitism to grow in Western democracies. The inability to say clearly and without equivocation, "This is anti-Semitism. It is unacceptable. It will be punished. Period." Compare that inadequate response to what Israeli President Herzog said during his visit. Herzog called the global rise of anti-Semitism a global emergency. Not a concern, not a troubling trend, an emergency. He said it plainly and directly and without equivocation. He defended Israel's actions. He honored the dead. And he said what needed to be said about the global crisis his community faces. He also said the most important thing anyone said during his entire visit. He said about the Bondi Beach victims and the wider Jewish community. The terrorists sought to sow terror among the Jewish people, and we respond with renewed Jewish pride, choosing life and hope. Choosing life and hope, not revenge, not despair, not retreat, life and hope. That is the message of a community that has survived persecution for thousands of years and refuses to be broken. That is the message that the violent protesters were trying to drown out with their riots. That is the message that 2.5 years of inadequate law enforcement response was slowly suffocating. And that is the message that every democratic government needs to protect and amplify rather than equivocate about for fear of political consequences. Let's talk about what needs to happen now, because identifying the problem without discussing solutions serves no one. Australian law enforcement needs to commit immediately and visibly to equal application of the law, regardless of the political cause of the protesters. If court orders are issued, they will be enforced. If police officers are assaulted, serious charges will follow. No exceptions based on the ideological identity of the protesters. Australian politicians need to have a direct, honest public conversation about what drove the Bondi Beach massacre. Not vague references to terrorism. Not careful diplomatic language about foreign conflicts. A direct, honest acknowledgement that radical Islamist ideology motivated an attack on a Jewish community, and that this ideology must be confronted directly within Australian society. The pattern of escalating anti-Semitism that preceded Bondi Beach must be addressed with comprehensive policy responses. 1,600 incidents in 1 year doesn't happen by accident. It happens because a culture has developed in certain communities that tolerates or encourages anti-Semitic behavior. That culture must be challenged directly through education, law enforcement, and community leadership. International leaders must treat the global rise of anti-Semitism as the genuine emergency that Herzog named it. Not a peripheral concern, not a secondary issue. A frontline crisis requiring immediate comprehensive response. And there must be a clear, widely enforced distinction drawn between legitimate political protest and the deliberate targeting of Jewish communities for harassment. These are not the same thing. They must not be treated as the same thing. And political leaders from every party must be willing to draw that distinction clearly, regardless of which political constituencies it might offend. Now let's zoom out to the biggest picture of all. Let's think about what this moment represents historically and why it matters beyond Australia. The Sydney riots happened because a head of state came to mourn 15 people murdered at a religious holiday. In virtually any other context, such a visit would be treated as unambiguously humanitarian. Even critics of a government's policies typically respect moments of grief and mourning. The fact that this visit triggered violent riots that required pepper spray and resulted in 27 arrests tells us something profound and disturbing about where Western societies are heading. The Jewish community in Australia and in many other Western countries has been so thoroughly dehumanized in certain political circles that even mourning terrorism victims becomes a justification for disruption and violence. The grief of Jewish people is not recognized as grief. The pain of Jewish communities is not recognized as pain. Their dead are not mourned as victims deserving of respect. This is the logic of anti-Semitism in its modern form. It presents itself as political opposition. It claims the language of human rights and liberation. But its consistent target is Jewish people, Jewish communities, and Jewish institutions, regardless of what any specific Israeli government does or doesn't do. When the target of your political anger is a community of grieving Australians who had nothing to do with Israeli government military decisions, you are not engaged in political protest. You are engaged in the collective punishment of Jewish people for the actions of a government they do not control and did not choose. That is anti-Semitism, dressed in political language, justified with geopolitical arguments, but anti-Semitism nonetheless. The 15 victims of Bondi Beach deserve to be mourned in peace. Their families deserved the comfort of an international solidarity visit without riots in the streets. The Jewish community of Australia deserved law enforcement protection for 2.5 years before a massacre forced authorities to finally act. They didn't get any of those things, and the failure to provide them was not accidental. It was the result of political calculations that treated Jewish safety as less important than other political priorities. Isaac Herzog was right. This is a global emergency. The Sydney riots are not a local Australian problem. They are a symptom of a global democratic failure, a failure to confront anti-Semitism clearly and forcefully, a failure to protect Jewish communities with the same energy applied to protecting other vulnerable communities, a failure to say without equivocation that the deliberate targeting of Jewish people, whether in terrorist attacks or in violent protests against mourning ceremonies, is unacceptable in any democratic society. Every Western government watching what happened in Sydney needs to ask themselves, are we making the same political calculations that led to 2.5 years of inadequate response in Australia? Are we equivocating about anti-Semitism because we are afraid of certain political constituencies? Are we waiting for our own Bondi Beach before we act? Because if the answer to any of those questions is yes, they already know how this story ends. 15 people murdered at a Hanukkah celebration. A community still grieving. A visiting president coming to offer comfort. Violent riots erupting in response. That is where 2.5 years of political cowardice in the face of rising anti-Semitism leads. The Jewish community in Australia chose life and hope. The least the rest of the democratic world can do is choose to protect them while they do it.